It is also attached by a few fibers to the transverse carpal ligament. The ulnar vessels and nerve lie on the lateral side of the tendon of this muscle, in the lower two-thirds of the forearm. Variations. Slips of origin from the coronoid. The epitrocleo anoconeus, a small muscle often present, runs from the back of the inner condyle to the olecranon over the ulnar nerve. The flexor digitorum sublimis is placed beneath the previous muscle. It is the largest of the muscles of the superficial group, and arises by three heads: humeral, ulnar, and radial. The humeral head arises from the medial epicondyle of the humerus by the common tendon, from the ulnar collateral ligament of the elbow joint, and from the intermuscular septa between it and the preceding muscles. The ulnar head arises from the medial side of the coronoid process, above the ulnar origin of the pronator teres. The radial head arises from the oblique line of the radius, extending from the radial tuberosity to the insertion of the pronator teres. The muscle speedily separates into two planes of muscular fibers, superficial and deep. The superficial plane divides into two parts which end in tendons for the middle and ring fingers. The deep plane gives off a muscular slip to join the portion of the superficial plane which is associated with the tendon of the ring finger, and then divides into two parts, which end in tendons for the index and little fingers. As the four tendons thus formed pass beneath the transverse carpal ligament into the palm of the hand, they are arranged in pairs, the superficial pair going to the middle and ring fingers, the deep pair to the index and little fingers. The tendons diverge from one another in the palm and form dorsal relations to the superficial volar arch and digital branches of the median and ulnar nerves. Opposite the bases of the first phalanges, each tendon divides into two slips to allow of the passage of the corresponding tendon of the flexor digitorum profundus. The two slips then reunite and form a grooved channel for the reception of the accompanying tendon of the flexor digitorum profundus. Finally, the tendon divides and is inserted into the sides of the second phalanx about its middle. Variations. Absence of radial head, of little finger portion. Accessory slips from ulnar tuberosity to the index and middle finger portions, from the inner head to the flexor profundus, from the ulnar to annular ligament to the little finger. The deep group. Flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis longus, pronator quadratus. The flexor digitorum profundus is situated on the ulnar side of the forearm, immediately beneath the superficial flexors. It arises from the upper three-fourths of the volar and medial surfaces of the body of the ulna, embracing the insertion of brachialis above, and extending below to within a short distance of the pronator quadratus. It also arises from a depression on the medial side of the coronoid process, by an aponeurosis from the upper three-fourths of the dorsal border of the ulna, in common with the flexor and extensor carpi ulnaris, and from the ulnar half of the interosseous membrane. The muscle ends in four tendons which run under the transverse carpal ligament dorsal to the tendons of the flexor digitorum sublimis. Opposite the first phalanges, the tendons pass through the openings in the tendons of the flexor digitorum sublimis and are finally inserted into the bases of the last phalanges. The portion of the muscle for the index finger is usually distinct throughout, but the tendons for the middle, ring, and little fingers are connected together by areolar tissue and tendinous slips as far as the palm of the hand. Fibrous sheaths of the flexor tendons. After leaving the palm, the tendons of the flexorus digitorum sublimis and profundus lie in osseo-aponeurotic canals, formed behind the phalanges and in front by strong fibrous bands, which arch across the tendons, and are attached on either side to the margins of the phalanges. Opposite the middle of the proximal and second phalanges the bands (digital vaginal ligaments) are very strong, and the fibers are transverse, but opposite the joints they are much thinner, and consist of annular and cruciate ligamentous fibers. Each canal contains a mucous sheath, which is reflected on the contained tendons. Within each canal the tendons of the flexorus digitorum sublimis and profundus are connected to each other, and to the phalanges, by slender tendinous bands called vincula tendina. There are two sets of these: (a) the vincula brevia, which are 2 in number in each finger, and consist of triangular bands of fibers, one connecting the tendon of the flexor digitorum sublimis to the front of the first interphalangeal joint and head of the first phalanx, and the other the tendon of the flexor digitorum profundus to the front of the second interphalangeal joint and head of the second phalanx. (b) the vincula longa, which connect the under surfaces of the tendons of the flexor digitorum profundus to those of the subjacent flexor sublimis after the tendons of the former have passed through the latter. Variations. The index finger portion may arise partly from the upper part of the radius. Slips from the inner head of the flexor sublimis, medial epicondyle, or the coronoid are found. Connection with the flexor pollicis longus. 4 small muscles, the lombricals, are connected with the tendons of the flexor profundus in the palm. They will be described with the muscles of the hand. The flexor pollicis longus is situated on the radial side of the forearm, lying in the same plane as the preceding. It arises from the grooved volar surface of the body of the radius, extending from immediately below the tuberosity and oblique line to within a short distance of the pronator quadratus. It arises also from the adjacent part of the interosseous membrane, and generally by a fleshy slip from the medial border of the coronoid process, or from the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The fibers end in a flattened tendon, which passes beneath the transverse carpal ligament, is then lodged between the lateral head of the flexor pollicis brevis and the oblique part of the adductor pollicis, and entering an osseo-aponeurotic canal, similar to those for the flexor tendons of the fingers, is inserted into the base of the distal phalanx of the thumb. The volar interosseous nerve and vessels pass downward on the front of the interosseous membrane between the flexor pollicis longus and flexor digitorum profundus. Variations. Slips may connect with flexor sublimis or profundus or pronator teres. An additional tendon to the index finger is sometimes found. The pronator quadratus is a small flat quadrilateral muscle extending across the front of the lower parts of the radius and ulna. It arises from the pronator ridge on the lower part of the volar surface of the body of the ulna, from the medial part of the volar surface of the lower fourth of the ulna, and from a strong aponeurosis which covers the medial third of the muscle. The fibers pass lateralward and slightly downward to be inserted into the lower fourth of the lateral border and the volar surface of the body of the radius. The deeper fibers of the muscle are inserted into the triangular area above the ulnar notch of the radius, an attachment comparable with the origin of the supinator from the triangular area below the radial notch of the ulna. Variations. Rarely absent. Split into 2 or 3 layers. Increased attachment upward or downward. Nerves. All the muscles of the superficial layer are supplied by the median